Hi, welcome to my blog and happy Easter weekend. So, we're nearing the end of Lent, and today is Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday, which commemorates the Thursday before the Easter weekend when Jesus and his disciples had the Last Supper and where Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Now, it's called Maundy Thursday because of the Old English word that comes from the Latin mandatum or commandment, reflecting Jesus' words in the narrative where Jesus washes his disciples' feet in John 13. Here he says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you." Now, the washing of the disciples' feet and the Last Supper appear in the Gospel of John 13, verse 1 to 20. And whilst the Last Supper narrative appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus washing his disciples' feet is unique to only John. There also isn't a lot of content in the other Gospels regarding the Last Supper, merely that the Last Supper occurs, and of course the institution of the Eucharist at this meal, which is what most of the artworks regarding the Last Supper focuses on, and in fact, a lot of them are titled The Institution of the Eucharist. But in John, we find a lot more information on this narrative. The Last Supper stretches over chapters 13 to 17, with Jesus giving some last teachings, promises, and a final prayer before the Stations of the Cross commence. Now, when reading John 13 through to 17, the washing of the feet and the Last Supper seems a little disconnected at first, or at least to me when I first read it, as if the washing of the feet is simply inserted as an introduction to the space where Jesus makes his final teachings and commandments to his disciples, as if introducing the characters and setting the scene. But this isn't the case. When thinking of the Last Supper, very often our thoughts don't go to the washing of the feet. When I ask you what comes to mind when thinking about the Last Supper, you'll probably tell me that you think of Da Vinci's famous mural of the Last Supper. Now, Da Vinci's portrayal of the Last Supper in popular culture is the Last Supper, but it's certainly not the whole story when you read the account of John. In fact, it represents very little of the historical Last Supper or the culture of the first century, which also wasn't what Da Vinci focused on when creating the mural. But what I want to do is introduce you to a different representation of the Last Supper to show what art can do when reading a text and how text and image can work together and complement each other. Instead of Da Vinci, when thinking of the Last Supper, I like to think of Tintoretto's The Washing of the Feet, created in 1548 to 1549 and commissioned by the Church of San Marchiola in Venice. This painting depicts the narrative we find in John 13, verse 1 to 20. Jesus has gotten up from the table, taken off his robe. We can see the familiar blue lying on the ground, has tied a towel or some sort of garment around his waist and filled a basin with water. Jesus seems to be in conversation with who we know to be Peter from the narrative. And he actually looks really similar to how we see Peter portrayed in most of Christian art. Most of the time, he is an elderly man. He's got a big beard. He often has gray or white hair. Sometimes he does have a full set of hair, and other times he's seen as balding. But from the text, we know that this is Peter. He doesn't have his key with him, but we know from the text it's Peter. So we see Peter, who seems to be protesting against Jesus washing his feet. Around him, we see the other disciples taking off their shoes and preparing their own feet to be washed by Jesus. And I specifically love the two figures to the left who seem to really be struggling with the taking off their pants and able to take off their shoes. I think it's such a human representation of perhaps a group of friends coming together. And there's always two people in a friend group who are just really funny when they're together. So in the background, of Tintoretto's work, we find this grand architecture, which Tintoretto might have taken from some part of Venice. We're not entirely sure, but it might have been familiar to the churchgoers who are in the church who commissioned this work. And to the right, which is the room that I'm really interested in, to the right of the artwork, we have this room which seems smaller than the space that we're in and is also much darker. And it's in this room where Tintoretto has placed the Last Supper. Now, I know this artwork might not technically be a Last Supper, and it's very clearly labeled the washing of the feet. So I'm not trying to say that this is wrong. This is actually a Last Supper, because obviously it's not. But just bear with me for a few seconds as to why I think that this really encapsulates the theme of the Last Supper. Um, what makes this portrayal that Tintoretto does, of what we find in the Last Supper narrative in John so important, I think, is the fact that firstly, it contains what one might think of as the whole narrative found in John. So we have the two events and two scenes in one picture plane, which I think is really smart. So Tintoretto very skillfully plays with time and space, which we see a lot of Christian art do, and which I think makes Christian art so a unique way through which text and theological ideas are communicated. So Tintoretto plays with time and space and links the two events of the narrative in order. So one might walk through the space where the washing of the feet has just happened into the next narrative in time in the same way that we read the text. So we go from the washing of the feet to the events of the Last Supper. Secondly, I think Tintoretto places the true theme of the narrative, which I would argue is love, and I will do so later on. He places love at the center of our viewing and way of thinking about the Last Supper. Perhaps controversially, I think Tintoretto does what Da Vinci doesn't do. He captions the essence of the theology of love behind the text, and when viewing the washing of the feet together with its counterpart, Tintoretto's Last Supper, which you can see here, which would have been placed to the left of the apse, and this washing of the feet would have been to the right. When we see these two together, we see that Da Vinci is clearly missing an element of the narrative, which is the washing of the feet. Now, looking more closely at the narrative in John and applying some good old social historical criticism and really utilizing my theology degree, which is what I love doing, is looking at the New Testament and history. The washing of the disciples' feet is intrinsically linked in meaning to the Last Supper, and they function together. The Last Supper scene, the main event, if you will, is chosen specifically by the author because the space wherein a meal takes place emphasizes the social dynamics between those who are involved in the meal in the first century Mediterranean context. Now, meals made statements about the relationship of the attendees, their social standing, their identities, and importantly, their honor. Now, typical to how meals and invitations would function in the first century context of Jesus, it would be customary for the host to supply water for the person to wash their hands and feet, or for someone of a lower social class, like a slave, to wash it for them. Important is to note that this would happen before the meal began, which is contrary to what happens in John. We explicitly read here that Jesus leaves the table after the meal, but commentators argue that this is before what we know as the Last Supper. So there is a distinction between the meals taking place. It really isn't clear, but we assume that Jesus returns to the table, or in the case of Tintoretto, returns to a different table or a different space at least, and then the events of the Last Supper proceed from there. For some scholars, the fact that the feet washing is out of place, that is to say, after a part of the meal has already taken place or once the festivities have began and not beforehand. For some scholars, this serves to emphasize the act not as a customary practice, as it would normally be understood in Judaism, but rather as a symbolic act. If we also take into account Peter's reaction towards Jesus, refusing to have his feet washed by him, because Jesus is of a higher social standing, then the element of honor also comes into play. Jesus lowers himself in social standing, going against what is socially acceptable, and washes the feet of those he is supposed to lead. The traditional understanding of the teaching Jesus is trying to make his disciples understand in this narrative account is that if Jesus is willing to humiliate himself and do this job, then as disciples, they should be willing to do even more for God. There's quite a lot written on the humility aspect of this scene, and it's often taken to be the central thing. And I'll link some articles below if you'd like to read them. But another interpretation can be given which focuses on Jesus' love and stretches throughout the whole narrative of the Last Supper, from chapter 13 to 17. When Jesus refers to himself here in the scenes, he does so in context of teacher or as Lord, and not as a slave or in a position of humbling himself. Therefore, some scholars, like van der Watt, argue that this was an act which shows Jesus' intense love to his disciples. This act of lowering oneself to a lower social standing as a result of intense love and affection can be found in other textual instances of the Hellenistic age, such as the love story of Joseph and Asenath, where Asenath lowers herself and washes Joseph's feet instead of one of the household virgins. And I'm going to link the text below as well. So she lowers herself and washes Joseph's feet instead of one of the household virgins. And she says, when he asks her, "Why are you doing this? Leave it to one of the household virgins." She replies with, "Why do you want that another virgin wash your feet? For your feet are my feet, and your hands are my hands, and your soul is my soul. Another will not wash your feet." Whereafter they exchange kisses. The notion of washing feet can then be interpreted not only as a way of humiliating or humbling oneself, but also as a way to express intense love for the other in the social context. Van der Watt writes in his article, "The focus is not on consistent humbleness in a slave-like way, but rather on devotion and affection that is willing to serve beyond what is expected." If this line of thinking is taken into account, then commentators such as Henshin, who argue that the washing of the disciples' feet is the greatest token of love and a culmination of all Jesus' deeds for the last 3 years of his ministry, becomes a very strong and arguably, in my opinion, favorable interpretation. Now, this is all very brief, and I think so much can be written on this idea, and I'm definitely going to explore and develop this further into a different format and perhaps an article. Now, love as a theme on its own is really important in the context of the pericope, and I think what Tintoretto successfully does is show Jesus as humbling himself. If we didn't know from the text that Jesus is the one washing the feet, then simply looking at Tintoretto, we would not be able to tell. His halo isn't shown to shine brighter. He's not physically bigger, as some iconographic motifs often show him and portray him in a hierarchical way. And he isn't surrounded by angels or wearing more decorative clothes. But keeping in mind the theme of love, looking at Tintoretto's work, we can see that Jesus is going to have a very intimate moment with each of the disciples, like the moment Joseph and Asenath had, knowing that Jesus is lowering himself out of eternal love and establishing a new commandment, which is the overarching theme of the Last Supper, a new commandment that is anchored in love. Now, what inspired me to go into this direction in researching the Last Supper and the washing of the disciples' feet is the VCS's video, or the visual commentary of scriptures video, on Maundy Thursday, presented by two of my lecturers, Dr. Jennifer Slivka, who I think is brilliant and who I love, and Professor Ben Quash, who I also love, and he's amazing. Now, in their video, they look at this oak carved statue of St. John the Apostle leaning on Christ's breast from the Bode Museum. Now, this small interaction between John, the beloved disciple, and Jesus appears in John 13, verse 23, where the scripture merely reads, lying back on Jesus' chest was one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. This interaction, which has been interpreted in art in many different ways throughout the centuries, is only a small extract from the larger Last Supper narrative. But when the washing of the disciples' feet are taken into account as an act of intense love, especially when we remember Tintoretto, we can imagine ourselves walking through the back doors, being transported from one event of love to the Last Supper, where we look over and see John resting on Jesus. An extremely tender and, I would say, somewhat intimate moment, with John leaning against Jesus' breast and also holding hands. This is what I love about art, that it has the ability to capture the theological themes of chapters worth of text, and within a singular extract show us that which is most important, and allows us as the viewer to make our own connections, whether it's with other scriptural passages, or for me personally, thinking about the symbolic significance of the beloved disciple at the foot of the cross as a representation of the believing community. Do we then look at the beloved disciple here and place ourselves in John's role, finding rest and comfort in Jesus and sharing in his intense and eternal love? I think the love within the Last Supper narrative, and specifically how it's emphasized in the washing of the feet, becomes an extremely important theme to keep in mind, and something which I generally look forward to exploring and learning more about, and seeing what art can add to this. So, as a closing note, I'd like to leave some ideas about art and our way of viewing, and how this might impact the way we read and think about texts. Now, in terms of the Last Supper, as I mentioned earlier, our minds might directly rest on the work of Da Vinci. But I urge you to take a look at some other instances of the Last Supper. For example, those made by Tintoretto, who really enjoyed painting the subject and did so numerous times in different compositions. Here, for example, we have two different compositions. That which is paired with the washing of the feet in the Church of San Marchiolo in Venice, which was painted around 1548 and that we just looked at, and the Last Supper housed in the Basilica di San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, painted between 1592 and 1594. In both of these instances, unlike in Da Vinci, we see that women are present and play a role in the Last Supper, serving Jesus and the disciples. And curiously, we also see children present. The presence of the women here in art seems to be much more natural than in Da Vinci's Last Supper or in the text, where we have a male gathering, and in Da Vinci we have a singular Mary Magdalene, who's not mentioned in the text at all. Surely there should be women present, especially as when we read Mark, Matthew, and John, the meal took place in a home, which is the domain of the women in the first century context. Art in this case can give us insight into a more realistic viewing of that which takes place in the text. And when coupled with realistic readings of the text, like the work that Dutoy does, whose articles I've linked below, and who focuses on the roles of women in the parables of Jesus, a more holistic and, I think, realistic understanding of the text can take place. In Tintoretto, I'd like to argue that women at the Last Supper form part of the theme of love Jesus speaks about and are shown to be true followers of Jesus. and can be seen as already mimicking the action of love and humility that Jesus showed when washing his disciples' feet, making a new commandment to act through love. I think art can therefore interpret that which is hidden beneath the textual surface and bring our attention to that which we are missing in text, giving us a chance to reevaluate the text and look for what we missed. Throughout my studies and for my dissertation at the University of Pretoria, and also the dissertation that I'll be doing at King's College, I'll focus specifically on this theme, how art gives us a glimpse into the text, of what is not there. And I argue that women in Christian art becomes a very important visual exegesis, and very important for our understanding of theology and for what we read in the Bible. Now, I've linked some articles below which relate to this discussion here, and some extra articles that I think are really important. As always, if you'd like to talk about anything or have a theme or artist you'd like me to cover or explore, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to have a discussion or to explore something new and that's out of my comfort zone. If you'd also like to see more contemporary artworks, I'd be happy to discuss that. It really is, a very Christian art really is very rich, and we think that Christian art only belongs to um, very early periods, but Christian art is very much alive in contemporary art. And contemporary art also has a way to really nudge us into directions that we haven't thought about. So, just as a quick example, I'd like to point you um, to The Last Supper by David LaChapelle. And it's part of a series of Jesus is My Homeboy. Now, this is actually an artist that one of my good friends, Helen, has put me onto, and I think it's really interesting. So, if you'd like me to do maybe a discussion on something more contemporary, um, I think I might actually have a conversation with Helen where we do a video together, where you can hear her thoughts on contemporary art. I think that would be really amazing. And actually, I'll have a chat to her and see what we can do, and if we have some time during exam essays. So thank you for joining me today. I hope this at least opened your mind to some ideas when looking at the Last Supper, and might turn your attention to something other than Da Vinci, or introduced you to Tintoretto. So I hope you have a wonderful Easter weekend, and I look forward to you joining me next time as well.